more chaotic, and maybe I really, to write Tears of the Trufflepig, I really forced myself to write every day. I wrote the whole draft in 3 months. So
3 months.
3 months, the whole draft. Like I wrote the whole thing on my typewriter, and I forced myself to do it. But this is, yeah, and I never done anything like it before, and I haven't done anything like that since.
Yeah.
The new novel that I just finished, it took me 7 years to write it, so
7 years.
I don't think that I could ever do it. It was just I think it was just the fear at the time of not having the time to write, because of that. It was the first time in my life. Okay, I gotta explain this whole thing. Like in 2014, when the first volume of Bullshit Artist came out, I was nominated for an award called the Alfredo Cisneros del Moral Award. It's not around anymore. It was the last year of it, actually. And I was nominated because for somebody Greg Barrios, the late great Greg Barrios, who passed away a few years ago. He read one of my stories and he nominated me for a prize. And I was like, okay, this was like in April of 2014. And then in July of 2014, I got a phone call from a strange number. I answered it. I never answered it. And they told me that I did not win the prize, but I won honorable mention, and that still came with $10,000. They gave me $10,000, and I never made any money. I never made, until my novel sold, Tears of the Trufflepig, I never made more than like $21,000 a year, because I worked in the restaurant industry. I worked as minimal as possible. So to me, $10,000 was like, oh my God, I was a barista at the time. And within that day, I think the next day after I got that award, my boss at the coffee shop told me that he sold the coffee shop, and that we had like 5 weeks to get out. So I was like, damn. And at the same time, a bookstore, Malvern Books, had just opened, and they were hiring somebody for 2 days a week. So I was like, okay, I went and they hired me for 2 days a week. I won that award, that honorable mention, and I lost my barista job. So I was like, okay, for the first time in my life, I'm working 2 days a week now. They gave me this $10,000. And I had a dog at the time. The dog was 5 years old. And during those 5 years, I never took him to the vet. He already had his shots when I got him, so I just couldn't afford it. So when I got that money, I took him to the vet for the first time, and I remember giving the person my card, and it was like $700, and I'm like, I didn't hesitate, I gave it to him, $700, and in that moment, when I paid those $700, I realized this money is gonna run out one day.
Yeah,
really, really fast. So from that fear, the fear of that money is going to run out, the fear of, for the first time in my life, I'm given money and time to write. I was like, I'm going to run out of money. If I run out of money and I don't have a finished draft of something, I'm screwed. Because I'm going to have to, because I know I'm going to have to work a lot. I know I'm going to have to I'm not going to have that luxury of working only 2 days a week for a long time. At least then, I had that fear. So based on these stark realizations of my reality, this is September 2014. They gave me that money that first week of September. I realized, holy shit. And then I really thought about what am I going to do? Am I going to revise all these old novels that I just never had finished? Or am I going to do something completely new? Somehow the idea of doing something completely new was more appealing to me. And also, like, it had been less than a year. Like, when I won that money, it had been less than a year. It had been like 10 months since my mother passed away. I had this huge, like, life-changing, like, things happening to me like that. And I hadn't written anything in a long time since my mother had died. So it had been almost a year since I've written anything. So I was like, I have to do something. So I had like a clean slate of like time and in my mind. So I was like, I really wanted to write something about death and mourning and loss without writing about those things directly. Because it was too heavy for me. Like my mother had passed away, whatever the hell. And so I funneled it all into Tears of a Trufflepig, and this character, and this reality of it. So there it is. There's the long and the short of it right there.
It's all about the hustle, pretty much. Yeah. The hustle pretty much that's the workout.
Yeah.
And I guess also like stepping away from your work for a bit, maybe like also gave you like all that time to think about, okay, now I'm going to charge all this creative energy into this one piece.
Yeah, well, I'm just thinking about those moments. I'm like, there was always, I think the only reason I'm a published writer is like by a hair. By a hair, I barely made it. Like every moment, like when I think about like even holding a book, I think about like in a movie when like a character like I say this frequently, like when a character is like running across a bridge and the bridge is falling apart behind them and they're just running. And then when you make it across, the character makes it across, they look back on the wake of destruction. And they're like, oh my God, I made it across the falling bridge, That's how it feels every moment. I'm like, when I look back on these moments, it's like I'm looking back on this wake of destruction. And I'm like, oh my God, I made it. Thank God. Or at least it feels something like that, even though it's still difficult always, but it's, I don't know, that's it.
And now you just got past and I made it for a 7-year book like you've been working on. So now we're
for 7 years, exactly. So I'm like, so it's good to have, I guess this is it. I guess I like to have different relationships with different stories, I like to have a story that I can finish like really, really fast. And I'm just like, I'm done. That's it. I did it on a page, I'm done, the story's done. When I have stories that I wrote, like the story in Valleyesque that took me the longest to write, it probably took me like 5 years to write it.
Damn.
And just because I didn't know what was gonna happen. Like I wrote chunks of it and I'm like, what the hell is this? And then I had to think about it for years and years. And it took me like 5 years to realize what that story was about,
Yeah. It's all about drafting, I guess. Yeah. Okay, cool. Another question I have here, kind of my last question pretty much, because I want to have some time for my students. And one I kind of felt weird trying to find the words, trying to ask you, even back at book people, especially because a wider crowd, it's Hispanic Heritage Month too. So I'm always wondering about audience specifically.
What, I'm sorry?
Audience.
Audience.
Yeah. Audience, specifically our audience in the 956.
Yes.
Do you ever feel that it has its reputation, as you know, as our fellow 956ers might know? Do you ever feel the wandering, judgmental eye of the 956 as a kind of like a collective entity, a la Big Brother, as a way I like to think about it, on your work? And how do you navigate through your fiction with that lens in mind, if ever? Because I always think about it when I look at everything I'm working on when it comes to like 956 themes.
Totally. I think the lens that I see it under is under the context of the history of the kinds of stories that have come from the region, or at least like that have been published from the region, So to me, like, and this is part of that struggle that I had back in 2014 of working on the old stuff or doing something new, and back then I really had to ask myself the hard questions. I'm like, a lot of my old stories that I wrote back then were a lot about, we're not nothing like any of these stories, I wrote a lot about, I grew up, I'm an immigrant. I was born in Mexico. My parents didn't grad. I doubt my parents graduated from high school in Mexico. I come from a Spanish speaking household. I grew up in a trailer in the middle of nowhere in South Texas, with a lot of poor, mean boys, and that bullied me all the time. But I'm like, why the hell am I gonna write about this? Why? I realized one day. I think what happened is that a writer from this region or something, or a Mexican American writer, published a sort of story collection that wasn't unlike my experience. So I'm like, why the hell am I gonna write something that somebody else is writing? Every 5 to 10 years, somebody's gonna publish a book like this. Why am I going to be that person to do this? You know, why am I going to perpetuate these kinds of stories? And why not try to do something unknown and different? You know, so. And that was you know, that wasn't the lowest hanging fruit for me back then. You know, it would have been easier for me to just rewrite my old stuff and just try to find some age or something. But I was like, hell no, I gotta do something completely different and new, especially since my mother had just passed away. And I was like, and a lot of my stories dealt with like my upbringing. I wasn't ready to deal with any of those things, you know, to deal with a reality and my family and all that stuff. So I was like, I need to find a way to take the concepts of storytelling that I guess learned and do something, try to access something different where I can still kind of tell the kinds of stories that I want to tell thematically without being obvious to me, you know, because, you know, I don't know, it just seemed, it seemed more important to just, you know, to do something that I could live with at the time, you know, at the time, because it felt too easy and too kind of cheap for me to be like, I'm just gonna revise my old stories about being a kid or whatever, being some stoner kid in the valley or whatever, you know. So I'm like, you know, there's great books from South Texas. You know, there's a book from South Texas. It was published in 1998 or 99 by this guy named Genaro Gonzalez, and it's called The Quixote Cult.
Yes.
And to me, it's the best novel ever written about in South Texas. And he wrote it like it's in the first person, and it takes place in the late 60s. It opens in the late 60s and it goes to the Chicano movement and stuff in the 70s. And it's about him being like a punk kid too, growing up, going to college. And I was like, you know, whatever the hell I wrote, like back then, this is like 2014. I was 32 years old. I realized whatever first novel I write is going to be a ripoff of what Genaro Gonzalez did. I realized that. I realized, you know, it's just going to be an updated version of this. Why am I going to do this? You know, it's all, and it has all the conflicts that everyone has growing up, you know, relationships, you know, coming into yourself as a person, your political awakening and stuff like that. Why do those things that everybody's gonna do every 10, 20 years or even every 2 years, you know? And it's fine. And don't get me wrong, I love these kinds of stories. I eat them up, obviously. But I realized that I could not contribute to that kind of stories, those kinds of stories, even though I had written already so many. You know, I had 2 books worth of stuff, you know. So I don't know.
But you found your own way to do it too.
I found a different way to do it. I realized that I'd rather trick myself or not trick myself. I'd rather, for the lack of a better word, try to smuggle these concepts into the reader, you know, instead of just force feeding them to them, you know. And in a way I say force feeding because that's what I would be doing. There's other authors who can do it better. I read, you know, I would like Richard Wright type fiction, you know, like stuff that is very like vicious and visceral, and a novel like that is published every once in a while, and I can really admire it. And I realized that I had been trying to like mimic these old styles, and they weren't really me. I needed to access something that was me, and all these other things I was willing to look, all these other old unpublished stories, I was willing to look at them and say, that this I tried, you know, I learned a lot from this. I learned who I was and who I was as a writer. There's other writers out there who are doing this and are doing this much better than I am and have been doing that for 100 years or whatever, almost. So, yeah, asking myself the hard questions, you know, it was hard. It was hard. It's, you know, I still do that. Even now, I'm like, what do I do now? You know, as a writer, you know, I don't know. I still try to ask myself the hard questions and I don't take it for granted. I don't take writing stories or anything like that for granted, you know. I don't know.
Definitely. Yeah. Awesome. And only because I'm watching time. I want to have some time for students, maybe. So let's see. Let's see. Going back to, I see there's comments still. What was the book title again for the one you mentioned?
The what now?
The Quixote one?
The Quixote Cult was published in
Quixote,
98, 99 by Arte Público Press. I'm trying to get, I wrote an essay about it for the Library of America. You can actually read it online. It's online.
Yeah, I think it's on your website too.
It's on my website. Yeah. So I'm trying to get like Penguin or somebody to reissue it. I don't know if they listen to me or whatever.
So
I think it's a good one. I think it's a great novel. And the way that that edition has a lot of errors that are like nobody copyedited the Spanish, and there's a lot of Spanish in the dialogue and slang that nobody copyedited it. So I want somebody to do that book justice.
Is it doing that? Let's see. Tech stuff. Okay, cool. So let's see. Let's start with my class really quick. So class, students, writers, what's up? If y'all can use the reaction thing on Zoom whenever you're ready with the question. Whoever wants to go first, there's some eager ones in here. I know they are. Y'all know who you are. If y'all can just raise your hand whenever you're ready. But in the meantime, it looks like you already have a question in chat from Bianca Perez. What's up, Bianca? Hi, Fernando. Great to hear you talk about your craft. Where do you get your inspiration from that isn't literary for your work?
Oh, great question. I love this question. I don't know. You know what? At the end of Valleyesque, the first people who I really thank are all my old coworkers, whether in the restaurant industry or in my bookstore jobs, because my coworkers inspire the hell out of me. You know, my coworkers are all geniuses, whether in restaurant industry or like in the bookstore, especially in the restaurant industry that breathes so much surrealism that is taken for granted. You know, just because of the way that, you know, I don't know. I used to be a dishwasher at for a French restaurant that's not too far from here called Justine's. I was there. I worked I get there at 4 p.m. and leave at 1:30, 2 in the morning. But nobody would bother me. I just be washing dishes, thinking about things. So I guess other than that, but other fun things, I guess I love music and stuff. I don't know, like the Criterion Channel. I don't know, like that. But recently, what inspires me recently? You know, young people who believe in art, or just not young people, just anyone who believes in art and the power of art and storytelling, and you know, those kinds of people really inspire me. People who, you know, who have the time, you know, to separate themselves from like capitalism, if it's possible, capitalism in our culture and art. I mean, I'm sorry, in our culture, our life, to embrace culture and art and all these things that we seemingly don't have time for. So anybody that makes time in their lives for these kinds of things, it's very, very hard. Those people inspire me, you know.
Definitely. And it's funny you mentioned the kitchen thing, especially me personally. My mom and my parents used to own a restaurant in Laredo, the whole business. And so you mentioned like the many different lives that come and go in the kitchen, especially in the borderlands, you know. There's many different kinds of stories that come and go, whether they're residents or not residents or citizens or trying to get their papers. Everyone's on a certain journey. And I think a lot of those experiences are really formative to my years. Especially as a kid, teenager, just working in the restaurant industry like that, especially in the nightlife. Like it's such an enriching environment for people like us. Definitely. Yeah. Awesome. Cool. Let's start with Jack. Jack, you want to go ahead and unmute?
There, I'm Jack. Sorry about the background noise. I'm actually in a Chinese restaurant right now. And I had a specific question about a specific short story, which is Queso. In Queso, I was really intrigued by the dialogue. I thought it was really funny to read. And sorry about the. should I type in chat if it's really hard to hear?
No, we can hear you just a little bit louder, maybe.
All right. So in Queso, the dialogue is really, really unique, and I was wondering how you get inspiration for a dialogue, or how you come up with it. Usually for me, I would like talk to myself for dialogue, see if it sounds natural. I just wanted to see what kind of what was it? Yeah, a technique that you use for your dialogue.
Yeah. You know, I'm kind of, something that I try to stay away from is like snappy cinematic dialogue, like dialogue that you can tell is just begging to be in a movie. If it's too much like a movie, I'm like, I can't do this. I throw a brick at it or I do something. I think in order for me to be excited about a story, there has to be like an unfilmable quality to it, you know, whether it's the language or something that happens in it. Like Trufflepig, my novel, I wrote it that way. I was like, I'm gonna write, I don't want, you know, it's kind of noirish and it has these kind of conventions, but I wanted to put something that was unfilmable about it, something that was even just a little bit unfilmable, you know. And that's what excited me about it. I was like, the unfilmable quality is what makes it exciting for me. That's what makes it literature for me, and not something that's like auditioning to be a movie or something like that, you know. Yeah, I stay away from that. Also, like in my first, something that I like now that I have written a few books and I work with like a few editors, and I kind of rein myself in a little bit, you know, but in Trufflepig, there's a lot of moments where like a character just talks from pages and pages. And I always think like and that comes also from like this, I don't want the snappy back and forth dialogue. And also like like in the valley, like people just talk, you know, people just monologue and you just listen to these people, you know.
And like those interjections, like
Yeah.
I keep hearing it from you, I'm just like, fuck, that sounds like home.
Yeah, so I'm like, you know, that's how people talk. I'm just gonna let this person talk for pages and pages, you know. And I think it happened like one time. The first time I ever saw somebody do that, I think was like in a George Orwell book that was like Down and Out in Paris and London or something. Like I think he meets somebody like a Russian dwarf or something, and it just talks for like 3-4 pages. And I remember reading it, I was like 20 years old. I was 21 years old or something. And I was like, oh my God, is this guy talking for pages and pages? I've never seen anybody do this, you know? So even because it was unsettling or something, it just stayed with me. I was like, okay. And of course, since then I've seen other writers do it. And I always like, okay, I actually get excited when I see somebody go for it. I'm like, and you see like, oh my God, this character's talking for 3-4 pages. I was like, okay, I was like, cool. I gotta give the writer props and the editor for letting them do that too. But so yeah, like I try not to be too cinematic with the dialogue. I also like now I'm very harsh on myself and I just remove all the excessive dialogue. Sometimes I have dialogue in there and like, why are these characters talking about this? Like the novel that I just finished, I revised the first entire 20,000 words because I had too much dialogue. And also like I realized this about the dialogue also. This is before I forget, I'll say this. I realized that whenever I have a lot of dialogue, I realize I'm trying to ignore something. I'm like, what am I ignoring here? Like these characters are just going back and forth. Why are they doing that? And I'm obviously ignoring something. And it's because you have, maybe you know the characters so much and you're having so much fun and you're vibing off of them or whatever. But what is the point? Why am I doing that other than just to show off that I'm connected to what I'm doing, you know? So yeah, I had to check myself various times. Whenever I'm in the first draft, I let myself do whatever the hell I want or whatever feels right. And then later on I come back to it and I'm like, why am I doing this? I let myself cut as much as possible and not worry that I'm ruining my precious thing. I'm like, no, you're never ruining it. You're always trying to shape this block, you know.
Shape the mold.
Yeah, shape this hunk of thing into like a torso or something, you know.
Definitely. I like unfilmable. I like the way you mentioned that. We just talked about show versus tell. I call it show versus tell versus you.
Yeah.
Because we all approach it differently. And I like the way you think of it, like especially just trying to describe something or show something, try to think of something that hasn't even been filmed before. Like,
Yeah.
try to describe that feeling.
Yeah.
I like that. I really like that. I really like that. Awesome. Let's see. Next up, we got Noah. Let's see how the audio is.
Hello. This is like more specific about like two stories, but were the music related stories real? Were the bands real?
Are the bands real?
Wait,
What?
yeah.
And which one, Noah?
Were the bands and like the music related stories real? Or were they real?
Were the bands real in your music related stories?
The bands?
Mhm. Or are they based on anything?
No. You know, in the bullshit artist stories,
Yeah.
yeah. You know, in that book is a special book to me, I guess, because it was the book that I was writing on the side. It was my fake book for years and years. It was like my exercise book, you know. Like I said, like in 2014, like I said, I was trying to assess what I had done or whatever. And I had this notebook where I let myself break every rule that I could. And whenever I read, like, you know, I read like interviews in the Paris Review and stuff or stuff like that. Whenever I see an interview with an author, I read it. And whenever an author would say that they never do this or that they have this rule, they never do that, I would write it down and I would try to do what that author said they would never do and try to make it work. For example, the one that always comes on the top of my head is that I read an interview with Jonathan Franzen one time where he said that the thing that turns him off the most is when you start a sentence with the word of. OF. He says that if he reads something and the first word is of, he puts it down immediately. And I was like, you know, I'm gonna do that. I'm gonna write my first sentence. So if you don't mind, I
Go for it, yeah.
So there's a story in Bullshit Artist where I start with the word of, and it's like, and it's the 8 incarnations of Pascal says of the 11 satyrs that drowned. So I was like, so my Bullshit Artist book at the time, it was like my exercise book because those were stories that I thought were stories. And it wasn't until I had like 3 or 4 fake band stories that I was like, oh my God, I'm writing something. I'm writing a book or something, you know, because they were all fake bands. And to me, it was fun. It was fun because they were all like a stories like in disguise or something. And it gave me an excuse to make up fake lyrics and to make up fake albums. And I wanted to use all this media that you don't usually see in a story and to put it all in there. And I was having fun. And every time I sat down and wrote a Bullshit Artist story, I was having the time of my life. Whenever I was writing anything else, I was like writing more structured material, more realist material, more kind of humorless material.
Wait.
Whenever I wrote Bullshit Artist, I was just having a blast, you know, and I consciously made every story kind of different. Like that story, the Hotel Cuerpo de la Paz story, I wanted to write like a haunted house kind of story that wasn't a haunted house story. And about this hotel that had this kind of power and about this band that could only harness this energy in this hotel.
Yeah.
You know? So that was my driving engine of the story. And there's always, all my stories always have like a driving engine that I guess I keep to myself. I keep a secret to myself. Like I'll say like, okay, this is my fake haunted house story, you know, and you know, there's something like that, or like this is like my what else kind of stories do I have in there, you know? But
fake bands,
yeah, and also like I really wanted to put every genre in this book. Like I wanted there to be a little bit of a Western, I wanted to be a little bit of a romance, a little bit of a sci-fi, and then I want, even if it's just for a little bit, you know, even if it's just a little bit of horror, like I said, the haunted house thing, and even if they're not directly these things, I wanted to like I said earlier, like to smuggle these concepts in, you know, I wanted to like sneak it in there, and I want, because I don't know, I wanted there to be something in there that the reader perhaps could walk away with, like there was something about that story that was not really I don't know, that was weird about it. Hopefully it is something like that, is that I always, like Trufflepig, for instance, like I said earlier, to me, I want to write something about death and dreams and reality. And how those three things weave together. And that was my driving engine of that story, of that novel, So I don't know. I think that whenever you write something, there needs to be something about it that is only for you.
Mhm.
Especially like in these workshop environments where you have to talk about something that is so personal. There needs to be an element of your stories that you keep only to yourself, And if only like maybe to protect yourself or to protect the story.
Mhm.
And especially if it's very, very personal to you in some kind of way. And especially, I think about, also like that, a few years ago when Bong Joon-ho won that Oscar for Parasite,
Mhm.
he quoted Martin Scorsese where he says that Martin Scorsese quote about, the most personal is the most creative, and I really think that, the most personal is the most creative, regardless of, it doesn't really have to be about you, but something that is intensely creative, even if it's not, doesn't have elements of your life in it, still has to be incredibly personal for you to reveal these things, So I don't know. I don't hold these things like lightly. I take them, I don't take it for granted to be a writer, I guess.
Awesome. Yeah, nice. Thank you. Next up, gonna go still with those that are with their hands raised. We'll go to chat in a second. Israel.
Hey, so my main interest right now is character development and character dynamics. So I was gonna ask, what is your thought process while creating characters and how they interact with other characters?
What do you think?
What's your thought process around characters and how they interact with other characters?
I'm not sure how they interact with your character. Sometimes I have a character in there and I just, sorry?
I was gonna say, is it, hello, everyone, are your characters, because I think I'm connected to what you're saying, and if I'm not, please correct me. Are your characters like living, breathing people as you're writing them? Are they,
Yeah,
do they exist
yeah,
as you craft a story around them?
yeah, I don't believe, I don't really believe at all in being weird for the sake of being weird, If I have a character or something in the story, it's usually because it just happens, maybe, It just happens, and I'm like, what is this person doing? Like when I was writing Trufflepig, for instance, I don't know if many of you have read it or whatever, but I'm still gonna. But anyway, there's a moment in in Trufflepig in the beginning where the main character interacts with somebody in a diner type area. And it wasn't until after I wrote that scene that I realized that character is also going to be one of the main characters in the story. I realized who that character was. It's going to be like that he was like a journalist character. But I didn't know who he was when I put him in there. And I often do that. I often put in like a character or something, and I don't know who they are or what is going on or why they're there. And these aspects of storytelling are what I think about a lot before I actually write, I guess. Even if I'm not consciously thinking about it, it's always there. And then I have to confront these things eventually. So the characters that I write, I never really feel that are invented characters. I never feel, even like that with my stories, I never feel possessive with my stories. I never like, I wrote this, like it's very hard for me to articulate the being an author, I guess, because of that reason. And I like to have these relationships with stories, and I guess, and this is, I guess, an important aspect of, I guess, the way I write stories now, and especially the stories in Valleyesque, is that I no longer write stories conceptually. I cannot write stories conceptually anymore. For instance, the Nostradamus baby stories, I could never be like, I'm gonna write a story about an earwax baby, you know? You know, that like, how would I do that? You know, but I have and I guess this is biased to for anybody who wants to be a writer, but now I have like a notebook or something, and I call it kind of like my notebook of first sentences in a way. And now whenever like a first sentence or something like that comes to me, I just write it down in the book, you know. And often, you know, I come up with a few, and sometimes when I'll sit down and I'll go through them and I'll read one, you know. And that particular story, I read that first sentence, and I was like, what the hell is this? You know, I gotta read that first sentence. The first sentence was, the day came when we had trouble hearing, and Denora and I got excited, but we'd have more wax to add to our Nostradamus baby.
That's so true.
I read that a few times. I was like, what the hell is that? And I read that first sentence probably for like a year and a half. And I think I wrote it down after putting hydrogen peroxide in my ear. I was there while I was laying down, and it was tingling in my ear. That sentence came to me, and I wrote it down. And it wasn't until like a year and a half, almost 2 years later, that I was like, I'm gonna finish this story. And after I told myself that, it took me like 5 days to finish the rest of it. So I have those kinds of relationships with stories. Like sometimes I have like a sentence or a paragraph that just sits for like a long, long time. And then the rest, when I realize what the rest of it is, I just write it. It's just there. So
nice. Next up, Sammy.
Okay, so this is perfect timing because you're kind of talking about process, and all my questions are about process. I have so many questions. Thank you so much for coming. I just want to start with that. I really, really loved reading the several stories we got to read, and I'm going to read a lot more. I loved it. So I guess I'll start with queso. I really loved queso, and I was trying to understand your process. It sounds like you it's almost like stream of consciousness. Would I be wrong in saying that you write more stream of consciousness?
You know, that particular story, I would say, if there's something like stream of consciousness or whatever, I don't really, I don't know if I'm comfortable with saying that I do anything like that. But that particular story, I would say, if any of these stories come close to anything like that, I would agree that story has something of that quality. And that story is probably like, I don't know, when I was younger, I read like James Joyce and that kind of stuff. And a lot of that language is very unpenetrable or inaccessible or something. But I realized when I was young, and I'm like, well, I don't know what any of this means, but I'm gonna fucking keep reading it or whatever. You know, whenever we sees or whatever. And I realized that, you know, something about, even if I kept reading it, even if I read the sentences that keep going, there's something about it that I understood, and I appreciated that.
Okay.
And later on, like, I guess with other kind of influences, I guess, but that particular story, I wrote it right after a job interview, and I was pissed. I was so pissed. I forget what I was so angry. I was angry at something, and I sat down and I was just laughing writing that story. But is that a story? I don't know. It's probably my most inaccessible, not really inaccessible, but my most like, is this a story? I don't know. People read it, people look at it, and like, I don't know. And I almost didn't put that story in there, actually, the queso story, because of that. Yeah, but
well, I was gonna ask
like, you know, if I don't know if my editor or anyone would have a problem, but if they would, I said I'm gonna put it as the first story, just to get it out of the way. And if they see it and they'll be like, this is too much, they'll be like, okay, the rest of the book is not like that, you know, and they'll forgive it because of that, and because it's so short. I think that if I would have been even just a page or two two pages too much. It would have been like too much, I think, for that story. Even though I love that story, but I think that it would just be too divisive, too like the reader would be like, I don't know, I don't have the time for this or whatever somebody would say. So I guess I'm hyper conscious of those kinds of things, because like I guess my stories are kind of weird, but they're also, I think, really conventional. The way the stories are told and the narrative of it, to me, is very conventional. Some weird things may happen, but to me, they're highly conventional stories in many ways,
Nice.
Well,
Uh,
I just have a auxiliary question. It's kind of about what you're saying. Is even though I know what you mean, it's almost like not like a story, but it feels complete. It feels right. And so, how did you know when to end it? And did you have to experiment with how to end it, or did it just happen naturally?
It just happened naturally. I'm like, I can't do anything else to the story. It's done. I just have to know when I'm done. I'm like, you look at it and you're like, I don't know what else I can do here. Where else I can go? I'm like, and also I just thought it was funny. I just thought it was funny. It made me laugh.
Yeah.
It made me laugh, and I was like, okay, whatever. I wrote it. I wrote it, and it was like nothing I'd ever written, and that's why I liked it. If it gives me a weird feeling that if I think that this is like 10%, this is for like 10% of readers out there. If I think that for like at least a little bit of a story, I'm like, okay, I'm doing something right, maybe, If I think that, yeah, like I'm doing something for like not a lot of people, I don't know, this needs to be like I think like a range, like 70-30% or something like that. 70% conventional, 30%, what the hell is this,
Do you have a range for it now? Like what's that percentage for you now?
It depends on story to story. Like I would say like queso story is probably like 90%, what the hell is this? 10% conventional. But then there's stories, like there's a story in here called The 29th of April that is straight up realist story in the first person. I would say it was 100% conventional, even though it's all in one long paragraph. That's the most unconventional thing about it.
Yeah, structure. Awesome. Thank you, Sammy. Next up, Mason.
I got a lot of questions, but I don't know. I mean, like I'm a musician, so I had a question about the house, but the story about the house band for the hotel. I mean, whenever they break up the band, it seems like they're jaded. They're bored and they're looking towards the future. They're staring into the abyss or at this pier or whatever. I'm wondering, is the band breaking up because they have higher aspirations or lower aspirations? Are they tired of just being a hotel band, or is being a hotel band overwhelming? And if that's supposed to be ambiguous to the reader, why or why not? I mean, that's my first question, I guess.
I don't know if it's ambiguous for the reader. I don't know. To me, it was just the proper ending of that story, growing up. Maybe I was thinking a lot about maybe people who I grew up with who were musicians, maybe in high school. And then something about it, they just moved away from it when they became an adult. And also like in bullshit artists, I kind of wanted to put in cameos of real people. And at the end of that bullshit, that story, the Hotel Cuerpo de la Paz story, I put in a cameo. I didn't put his name in it, but I put T-Boone Pickens in it, who was this Texas billionaire who put all these wind things anywhere. He died recently anyway, but at the time, this is like 15 years ago, like 13, 14 years ago, when I wrote that story, I read this long form article about him. And something about him just I don't know, something about his persona and his voice. I could hear his voice in my head, I guess, because I read the article. So the way he just pops in there at the end and that story ends, I thought it was appropriate. And the way he just looks at him and then he's like, I got better things to do or whatever, I just thought it was really to me, like that image of just like them far away, you see these guys, just the image, these four guys in the suits. It reminded me also of this Fellini movie called I Vitelloni, which is a black and white movie. But on the cover, even if you've never seen it, you see the cover is you see all these 4 or 5 young men and on a beach or something. And just that image, like I remember renting movies as a kid and seeing that image. I was like, and I watched that movie until I was like in my late 20s or whatever, but something about that image, that Fellini, that from that movie that just stuck with me, and perhaps just these images that just stay with us, that just sneak their way into our stories or whatever. And I don't know, I don't really have a real explanation about ambiguity or anything like that, because I'm never trying to be vague. I'm never trying to be like, I'll let the reader figure this out, you know. I'm never trying to do that. To me, it just seemed like the logical conclusion to the story, or as much as I could do with it, you know, because the storyteller is me, that's what it is. If somebody else would have written it, perhaps the story would have ended a different way, you know.
Awesome.
And then I had another question, if I can ask a follow-up. Nostradamus baby story, it seemed at times that you were kind of poking fun at your own like community, like the writer community at times. And it also seemed that you were kind of making fun of people that are brand new parents that do nothing but post pictures of their kids on Facebook and stuff. And I was wondering if that was like, what was the theme of that story whenever you were coming up with it? Like, yeah, an earwax baby, but like, what was your like overall like thing that you were trying to tell the reader with that story?
You know, I don't really think that I ever have an agenda when I write a story. I don't really think I want to tell. I want this to come across to the reader. I also never think that I'm writing anything to like make fun of anything. If there's humor in it, it's accidental. But to me, it's not only maybe too cruel, but also too hard to try to make fun of somebody or anybody in a story. I'm like, I don't have the motivation to do something like that. But for that story, the Nostradamus baby, I will say this, that I really wanted to write a story about a fixer, you know, about a fixer, kind of like an old-time Hollywood fixer, you know, with the guy who you would call when, I don't know, where your handsome lead actor got a DWI or whatever, and then you call him to patch things up or whatever the hell. And I like the idea of a fixer, but with like storytelling, you know, with like people who want to tell stories and can't finish how to end it, and you go to somebody and they're like, oh yeah, just do this or whatever. And so it was kind of like a way to like write like again like a noir type story, like maybe like a Raymond Chandler kind of detective kind of story, but about a guy, about a fixer, about a literary fixer, you know. And also in that story, I like having sometimes like an arc that is not obvious about the main character. So in that story, my motivating arc was, I forget her name, but the sister in that story, the character who is the sister to the partner of the story, I forget her name, but she has an arc of the story. Even though she's the background character, she's kind of like the manipulator too. She has like a business sense. She's like, in a way, she's manipulating her like brother-in-law, whatever, into making money for her. She's like an agent, you know. I really wanted to have like a hustler in the background, and I would really want it to be her, you know. And I think at the end, like you see her kind of go through like a change, you know. She quits drinking something. It's like under the table, you know. It's not really in the foreground of the story. And then when the story ends, she's back in school, and then at the end. And I think the last line of the story is her saying something like, the less sugar and milk, the better, or whatever, you know. So I was like, you know, I wanted this character who's in a path of enlightenment, not enlightenment, but like, I don't know, capitalist enlightenment or something like this, like her, like upward mobility, I guess is like the term, but like through shady means, through unconventional means. And I had these different themes that I was just trying to juggle in that story, and And I also wanted, I like sometimes writing fake stories and fake books that I would never write. So some of these that are in there, like that seem like extravagant. Like, why would anybody write a story like this? Like, I don't know. To me, it's funny sometimes to just try and make up sometimes. It's not funny, but it's fun. It's fun to make up things like that because I could never write a story. I could never write a story with these things. So I try to fit in things, themes and things and stories that you couldn't normally fit into a story. Even if it's just for a little bit. If your story is not about that, I'm like, I want to try and fit something in here that my story is not really about, but that'll give it an extra edge to something, you know.
Mhm.
I don't know, but I'm never trying to make fun of something. People, especially that story, people usually like think that I'm making fun of something, that I'm making fun of writers or something. And I'm not. You know, I was trying to write like a kind of like a fake auto fiction story,
Mhm.
but it's completely whenever I try to write something about myself now, it's that's how it comes out. It comes out completely like bonkers, weird, like, and I end up not being successful in what I originally want. I was like, oh, I just wrote another weird story, but my aim was to write something personal. And I guess it ends up being personal every time, but not how I originally envisioned.
Awesome. Sweet. Next up. In class.
Can I interject?
Yeah, go for it.
Because Sophia's got a great question up there, which I think is connected to what you're saying about the unconventional and
Yeah.
not weird, right? This sense of like when you're scared, like if
We
it's
scared to
something,
work out there and have it be publicly read. So
yeah.
who's struggling to share their work? You know, I was the kind of writer who I was a private writer almost my whole life, until I won that award in 2014. I was 32 then. But I had already been writing consistently for 10 years and I never really had anybody, I never went to school. I never really had a writing group or any kind of things like that. So I don't know. To me, it was all private. So I was never really, I was ignorant as to how people became writers and how to publish books. I was ignorant. I just didn't know. I just didn't know about MFA programs. I didn't know about agents or anything. I was just like, I'm just gonna write stories. I don't know. It gave me something to do. It gave me what Octavia Butler calls a positive obsession. It gave me a positive obsession, among so many negative obsessions I had at the time, So to me, around the time that I was 28, 29 years old, 29 especially, where I really started to think, I was like, man, I'm gonna be 30 soon. And I was like, what am I good at in my life? And the only thing that I could think of, if I was good at anything, was writing stories, even though nobody had ever read really anything. And it's just what I consistently been doing throughout my 20s. And I just never stopped. So I was like, one time I watched, and this is my turning point, where I watched a documentary about the photographer Vivian Maier. Y'all know Vivian Maier, who was she was a nanny from Chicago her whole life, who took photographs. And nobody ever saw these photographs until after she died. And the people who, I guess she was a nanny for, gave away all her negatives. They sold her negatives. And it wasn't until like they discovered that now she's famous. You see her prints, you can just Google her work, and it's beautiful. But I realized at the time, I really glamorized at the time, right up until 30, I was like, nobody really knew that I was a writer, unless you had a close relationship with me or we were roommates. You didn't know I was a writer. My family didn't know that I was a writer. So it's something that I kept secret. So it's something that that I never really talked about until until that moment. Like I saw that documentary and I was like, I can't let anything like this happen. I realized that I had a lot of stories around. I was like, I used to think, wouldn't it be funny if, at the time I was here, like I was a resident alien. I didn't become a US citizen until 2017 when I was 35. So at the time, and I had a few precarious kind of moments where my visa expired. So I would always have these moments that I was like, wouldn't it be funny if I got deported and they found all my fucking stories? Like I had this idea, and like this glamorous idea or whatever. And glamorous to me at the time because my life wasn't great. So but after that moment, I was like, I can't let that happen to me. I was like, I realized like, why am I doing this? And after that moment, I actively tried to learn how people became writers. I was 30 years old. I was 31 years old, So it took me a while, it took me a long time to learn about it, to learn about the publishing industry. Thank God I worked in a bookstore. I got hired at a bookstore, and working in a bookstore really taught me a lot. I really learned about independent presses, big presses, the difference between all these things, self-published things. I really got to know about the whole spectrum of it. So yeah, that's all. Yeah.
Nice. Awesome. I kind of love this question that Lily has right here. Hi, Fernando. Thanks so much for visiting us today. I wanted to ask, how much has the reader feedback affected the way you write, if at all? They're about to do their first little mini workshop next week, where they show excerpts and stuff like that. So yeah, I'm really curious what you think of that.
I use this one frequently. I don't know if it makes sense to use it or whatever the hell. What about rejection? I think about rejection. But to me, like, if you want to be like a writer, it's like, you can't be afraid of rejection. To me, I guess it was like, if you want to be a boxer, you can't be afraid of getting punched in the face. You're going to get punched in the face a lot. All right. And you can't be afraid of it. You gotta be like, that just comes with just part of the game, So that's how I take rejection now. I'm like, it comes with the game. When you see a boxer out there, he's not, oh no, they're gonna punch me in the face, He's like, oh no, like, how do you not get punched in the face if you want to be a boxer? So that's what I try to remember, like things like that, like, and also like, there's only so much that a reader can understand of what even if they connect to what something you write, they may not be connecting about something that you connect with in the story. You know what I mean? So always remember that there's something in your story. If you're connecting with something in the story, that is what is important. And if you protect that, and then whatever criticism anybody has can only enhance what you're trying to do. And also it's important sometimes you do things that that don't give it, sometimes you're not giving it your all and you don't know. And that's what a reader is for, an attentive reader is for. Sometimes a reader is like, I think you can do a little bit more here. And that's the type of criticism that I really take. I really listen to, especially now, now in my life, working with editors, I really listen to people and I really trust people. Because now people understand the kind of stories that I kind of write, and they don't expect a certain kind of story from me. So when somebody talks to me about one of my stories, an editor or something, I trust them because they know what the kind of writer that I am, and they know what kind of stories I don't write, So now, so I listen to people now more than I did before. Before I was like, okay, like that story may not work for that person. For instance, that queso story. If you can imagine that story being workshop, think about that story being workshop. That queso story, How can I defend it? So I'm like, how could you rewrite that story? So I was like, so you just gotta be comfortable. You just gotta be saying, look, I did that with that story. That's like a crash landing kind of narrative story, So yeah, so you just gotta be like, you just gotta know when to let stories go and know when you can work on a story a little bit more, you know. I guess.
Love it.
But it's always learning, it's never the same.
Yeah.
After you finish a story, you have to completely forget the rules that you know already and move on to the next story. You have to relearn storytelling literally every time you write a new story, you know. In my opinion, I don't know.
Sweet. Awesome. I think we have time for one more question, and I think Jack's eager to ask it. So Jack, you want to go ahead and speak up if you can?
Sure thing. All right. So within the story of Ropa Isada, there, oh sorry, do I need to say that again?
Maybe. Hold on.
Someone's mic is on.
What do you
Yeah,
think?
someone's mic is on.
Yeah, sorry, background
You're
noise.
good. Okay. You're good.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay.
Go ahead.
So within the story of Ropa Yusada, whether if it was intentional or not, there was a very like surreal aspect to it, like dreamlike feel. And I was just wondering if you had a main inspiration for this surrealist aspect of your story, whether it be an artist or another writer.
You know, that particular story, Roposada, I think does have a direct inspiration on Alice in Wonderland. You know, I really wanted to write like an Alice in Wonderland kind of story, especially, you know, especially if it's something that has been there my whole life. Like I really thought about it like Alice in Wonderland. Like when we're kids, when I was a kid, Alice in Wonderland was like this Disney thing, like the Disney movie. And then as I got older, I realized, oh, it's a book. It's a book. And then later when I got older, I'm like, oh, it was written by this creepy guy, you know? So there's different layers to Alice in Wonderland that kind of unravel in everyone's life, really, you know? So I really had this idea of that Roposada place. And again, that was another story that I had the first sentence for the longest time, you know. And that's first sentence for that story. I had it in a notebook. And that Roposada story is actually the last story I wrote for this book, for Valleyesque. And it wasn't until I looked at the table, whenever I work on a short story collection, well, I can't really say that. For this particular short story collection, I looked at the title page of all the stories, and I just had a list. I typed them all on my typewriter, and I just looked at the story names. And I had 13, and I looked at them. I was like, it just felt it didn't feel balanced to me. The story, I was like, I gotta have another story in there. I gotta have another story in there that was surrealist and that balanced out my other realist story in there. And then I realized that it was that one. I was like, this was like probably like January 2020, right before the pandemic. Because my book, this sold in March of 2020. So I'm sorry, in May of 2020. And I sent it to my agent in March of 2020. So in late January of 2020, I finished that story, Proposada. And I just had that first sentence there in my notebook for the longest time. And when I realized that it was going to be the Roposada, kind of like the Roposada was going to be like its own dimension, its own little world. When I realized that, I was like, oh my God, if somebody else is going to write the story if I don't write it, you know? To me, it was so obvious. It was like really obvious, just like the Trufflepig story, the Trufflepig. When I realized, you know, that my story took place in like a border with two border walls and a third one about to be erected. When I realized that, I was like, oh my gosh, somebody else is already doing this. Somebody's gonna do this because this is too good. At least I thought at the time this is too good. Somebody else is, I bet you, is already working on this right now. So I gotta be the first person to do this, you know. So the Roposada story was also one of those stories. When I realized that the Roposada was gonna have this own little thing, I realized I gotta be the person to write that story. So I wrote it really, really fast because it became obvious what the narrative was gonna be. And I just wrote it really, really fast. So yeah, so I like that story a lot because it's one of my favorite stories, and I like all the stories. I have a different relationship with all these stories, but that story, maybe because it's the last one that I put in there, is special to me.
Nice. So you kind of went down like your own little rabbit hole.
Yeah.
Yeah, if we're stuck into the Alice in Wonderland, those metaphors.
Yeah.
Awesome, sweet. So I think only because class is about to end for us. I think that's all the time we have today. Maybe. Yeah. Okay. Cool. Awesome. So, for those of you still in chat, what's up? And viewing. Thanks for coming. Thank you for coming. Tonight we have a reading at Highland Campus. Okay. From 7 to 8 p.m. Fernando's going to read for us. Are we going to sell your books there? Yes, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Oh, so Sammy asked in the chat. We are going to sell his books, so you can look forward to that. Yeah, and then also on Saturday, we are doing the 50th year Riverbat Homecoming Fest. A handful of our creative writing department will be reading our work as a part of it at the Latinx stage, right? Yeah. Move this. Times Roy Garza goes on at 11:30 a.m. Then there's a big chunk in between where Yesela goes in at 1:40, and I think I ended the whole thing at 1:50, I guess. Cool. So you can look forward to that, especially those of you in class that need to go to events anyway. And you see them nodding their head. Awesome. Thank you, Fernando.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yay.
I'll see most of you tonight, or all of you tonight.
Awesome. Anything in chat left? Thank you so much. Yeah, cool. Awesome. Thank y'all. Class, everyone else, y'all good to go for the day. Guests, thank you for coming. Thanks for this cool little interaction. This is different for us over at English 2307. So thank you for coming. Where's the reading on campus? Let me go back. Highland Campus, building 2000, room 2560. Right? Yeah, cool, awesome. Yeah. And I'll probably send out an announcement in the class just in case. But yeah, I'll see y'all later. End meeting, leave meeting, stop share. Cool. Leave meeting. And meeting.